Hey folks, it's Nate, and it's time to go back to the drawing board. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about a video I saw from Donald DeLay. Um, and it was a kind of an interesting video talking a little bit about the importance of art, of really catching the eye, and of kind of favoring artists over brand identity, characters, or publisher, things like that, and how it's important to do that in order to rebuild a bit of the health in the industry. It's a very interesting video. It's very insightful. I've linked it below. So if you haven't seen that yet, go ahead and watch that to get kind of an idea of what I'm talking about. It's a pretty short video, just I think 6 or 7 minutes. So yeah, go ahead, click on that link if you don't follow his content. If you do, and you know the one I'm talking about, well, you're a step ahead of the game. But there's basically one part in there that really jumped out at me because I hear it debated back and forth a lot, and that's the attempt to make practical costumes for superheroes in particular. Now, a lot of what I'm going to say doesn't really apply to comics that try and be a little more realistic or fall outside the superhero genre, particularly if you're going for a slice of life kind of thing, or perhaps a more sci-fi kind of a vibe. Those do have a very strong sense of their own aesthetics. They do tend to be a little more bland in the design of things like costumes. In particular, slice of life stuff goes with very normal clothing, but it goes very over the top in expressions, in posture, ridiculous backgrounds, things like that. And science fiction clothing tends to be fairly utilitarian. And for some reason, we all wear jumpsuits in the future, I guess. Um, but yeah, so there are their own aesthetics in those genres in particular. And of course, horror comics tend to be very contemporary. So a lot of the people in them just dress like the people we see around us. Um, so yeah, again, a lot of what I'm going to say is strictly in the context of superhero stuff, and at the same time, I think if you look at Brutus the Badass, Donald himself, kind of recognizes that Brutus's costume is fairly simple. I mean, I think the only really unrealistic or impractical aspect of it is his belt buckle. And there are, real people who have flashy belt buckles like that, and maybe the metal greaves that are strapped to his boots for no real reason in particular. But again, Brutus is kind of a sci-fi comic more than it is traditional superhero stuff. So I think part of the science fiction aesthetic is in play there. Um, anyways, what's very often debated is a practical costume. How realistic a costume is, or how much sense it makes, versus just something that really pops out and really looks cool. And there's a lot to be said about just drawing whatever looks cool. However, I think this is kind of important. Most comics, especially in the West, appeal to a narrower demographic. They tend to be very geeky. They tend to be a bit on the spectrum, as it were, um, and sometimes blatantly impractical stuff can actually impact immersion, and your audience may not like wildly out of place looking things. So there's definitely a certain aspect of it where you have to think, um, I know for my part, I lean a bit towards the practical side of stuff, just because um, stupidly impractical stuff just ruins my immersion, it ruins my enjoyment. And I find myself thinking, what kind of idiot carries that around? Now, this is not, and again, I'm not criticizing Donald's point of view. Well, I guess I can't really say that for certain without talking to him about it directly. The big thing is, I think that a lot of people feel like it has to go to one extreme or another, um, and it really doesn't. I mean, there is kind of a middle ground. Like, for my part, um, I don't mind things like the wings on Captain America's helmet, um, or mask or cowl or whatever it is in the comics. Like that doesn't bother me at all. You won't find them in real helmets because they get caught on things. There's something an opponent can naturally grab onto and wrench your head around. You don't want that, practically speaking. But they look cool, and they give Cap that feeling of rushing forward, into the line of fire. That's a very important part of his character, and that kind of embellishment really makes him feel better, feel more complete. Um, on the other hand, there are other embellishments where I I almost can't I almost can't stand them. A great example of that is actually in the anime Trigun. There's a character, uh, really a fantastic villain by the name of Legato Blue Summers. But he has this shoulder pauldron that has spikes with skulls stuck on them, and like these spikes are probably a foot to a foot and a half long, and that kind of thing. Like every time I looked at Legato, I had a very hard time taking him seriously. I think it's one of the great achievements of the series that, in spite of how utterly absurd Legato looks, they still managed to make him a fantastic villain. If you're wondering what I'm talking about, just Google the name Legato Blue Summers, and I'm sure you'll find a bunch of excellent pictures of the absurdity that is his costume. And actually, Trigun is a pretty good study in costumes in general. Um, Vash the Stampede, who is the protagonist of Trigun, if you're not familiar with it, has a very great costume. It has a ton of stupid extra belts. They serve no practical purpose, but they look really cool. And I'll be the first to admit I'm a sucker for extra belts. Um, and then you have people like, um, of course, there's Legato Blue Summers, very impractical costume. On the other end of the spectrum, you have people like Meryl Streep and Millie Thompson, who have very basic run-of-the-mill costumes. They're basically their desert gear, some kind of an overgarment to keep the sun off of them and keep the sand out of uncomfortable body parts, and then under that, fairly normal clothing. Of course, Millie and Meryl are fairly normal characters in the world of Trigun. They're not super gunslingers or anything like that, so it kind of makes sense for them. Then there's a character like Moniv the Gale. His costume, at first glance, it looks very simple. He's just wearing a purple bodysuit, but then he has the chain guns on his wrists, and the ammo feed, and the motorized ammunition feeder on his back that keeps the whole setup running. And he has the helmet, and most of these costume elements are not terribly practical, but they look cool, and more importantly, um, none of it screams. Um, none of it really screams. This is absurd, like Legato's costume does. Um, so I think it's very easy to say, um, just let your imagination do whatever. But I find that typically, if you allow yourself to be constrained within certain limits, it's actually more of a creative exercise to work around them. Um, so, say you're designing a character and you set yourself the limit of, well, there's only going to be um, I can only emphasize maybe this character's shoulders. So you give him really overdeveloped shoulder pauldrons, or maybe you slap a big logo on his shoulder pads, like a skull or a skull and crossbones or something outlandish like that. But most of the rest of his character design is fairly normal and straightforward. Or maybe you say this character's shtick is belts, and he's got belts everywhere because that's just freaking awesome. And so you just focus on using one element of the character to express what's over the top and gonzo about him. Um, and I think if you look at it, designing a character as an exercise in um, what constraints you will accept, you will get better characters, more distinct characters, even. Because if every character is just a riot of shapes and silly elements, they're actually going to be harder to comprehend and to remember. They're just going to be a blur almost. Um, so that's another thing to think about. Human beings have a kind of concept fatigue, uh, and you don't want to overtax them in presenting them with a riotous bunch of different and varied characters. The X-Men are a great example of how not to do that. They have their costume designs are very unified. They all have that X motif. Um, of course, a lot of the classic iconic costumes people think of come in the color palette of blue and yellow, which is a very strong palette. Um, and I'm thinking, of course, of the iconic costumes from the '90s TV show. Um, they were very thematic without being without really being quite uniforms, I guess. Because while there were similar elements in a lot of them, every character also had their own spin on them. And of course, Storm and Rogue and Gambit, they all kind of had their own color palettes as well. So there's a lot of things you can do in specifically costume design within relatively narrow confines, and of course you can go over the top, and it's going to be a very subjective thing whether a costume crosses the line from simply strong and impactful to silly. But it's definitely a line that you have to watch out for. And as costumes become more and more impractical, people begin to wonder, you know, who would even dress like this? Um, everyone is cool with a pair of pirate boots on their superhero. You can even put them in full pirate gear and a cape. But if the fold over on the boots comes all the way down to the top of the feet, or if say their hat covers their entire face and they can't see out over it, people are going to start raising eyebrows. It's not that you couldn't do any one of those elements, but the more of them you pile on, the harder a character is to accept. especially if you're going for a fairly realistic aesthetic in your story. Now, if you're not, I mean, sure, pile them all on. Um, Go for broke, be as silly as you want. The tone of your story and the tone of your world is going to be a part of your character design as well. But it's good to really put thought into it ahead of time to say, what is the impression my story is making? What is the impression my character needs to make? What is the audience I am aiming for? How much over the top character design are they going to put up with? Because while, yeah, you can say, I want to tell the story I want to tell, um, if no audience wants to listen to your story, well, you're just pleasing yourself, and really, you don't want to make a comic. You just want to get a room. So yeah, just a few things to think about. I think that the comparison of practical versus cool factor is not always fair. I know there are a lot of people um, who are very into um, comic books or fantasy stories and movies and video games, who nevertheless find wildly impractical stuff to be a bit of a turnoff. I mean, there's even a YouTube channel run by a guy who goes by Scholagrim, and he spends his time analyzing weapons, in particularly from video games and movies and manga and the like, on their practicality. So don't think that there's no audience that geeks out over how practical and real life effective a costume or a weapon or another thing would be. There's definitely that audience out there, and they are a part of your audience. However, just as your audience will have a certain tolerance for the wild and the fantastic, these people will as well. You don't have to cater exclusively to their desires. There's a give and take at play. And it's just, it's one of those things you kind of have to get in there and feel out. Another thing to point out is, of course, that these design decisions are not permanent. People's costumes and whatnot change all the time. So if you find something you're not really satisfied with, you can always change it as time goes on. So yeah, I'm not really criticizing. I'm just, there's a lot of nuance to these discussions, and a lot of the times, especially in YouTube videos, you just sort of gloss over them and say, work it out on your own. And I guess part of working it out on my own, in my case, is just digging into all the little nuances that can make a difference. So yeah, there's my thoughts on it. I hope you enjoyed them. That's about all. So there's a like button and a subscribe button down there. Use them as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.